Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Malak Ibrahim Mohamed. I am a third year medical student, and today I will be going over the spinal cord, inshallah. Now, I will be covering all four spinal cord lectures that you guys took. However, I know that most of you will probably be watching this before your TBL. So you can stop over here at the ascending sensory tracts because this is where you have your TBL. You stop here. And so if you want to, go over the spinal cord lesions later on your own time and study it, you can do that. But you can study till here until for your TBL on Monday, inshallah. Okay, so before we start talking about the spinal cord, we need to talk about its surrounding structures. So that starts with the vertebra. You have a total of 33 vertebrae that are divided into different sections. So you have the cervical vertebra, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. The spinal cord would lie within the vertebral canal that is formed by these vertebrae. And the spinal cord starts from the foramen magnum of the skull all the way to the L1 to L2 intervertebral disc in adults and ends at the level of L2 to L3 in children. Now, everything that I have in red for you that is bolded with a star near it pretty much means please memorize it because it's very, very important. High yield, probably in your past, definitely in your past, and you'll probably be asked on it. So keep that in mind. Now, why is knowing where the spinal cord ends important? It is important because of the lumbar puncture. Now, the lumbar puncture is a procedure where you would insert a needle into these subarachnoid space in order to collect CSF fluid. You want to examine it for whatever reason. So when you insert this needle, you don't want to injure the spinal cord, and that's why you have to insert it below the level where the spinal cord ends. So because we said in adults, the spinal cords end at the level of L1 to L2, this means that you would insert the needle one level below that, so at the level of L2 to L3. That is how it is in adults. However, in children, we said that the spinal cord ends at the level of L3 to L4. So you want to go one level below that and insert the needle over here at the level of L4 to L5. All right, now let's talk about more features of the vertebra. You have the vertebral foramen and a bunch of vertebral foramen stacked on top of each other would form the vertebral canal where your spinal cord would go through. It's like a cable running through them. You have two parts of your of your vertebra that would form this vertebral foramen. You have the pedicle and you have the lamina over here. So the pedicle and the lamina on both sides would form this vertebral foramen. Now, a special feature about the cervical vertebra that I want you to remember is the foramen transversarium. The foramen transversarium is important because it allows for the passageway of the vertebral arteries. I will explain what these do later, but remember it for now, okay? Now we have the vertebral notch that would form the intervertebral foramen, and that would act as the exit point for the spinal nerves. So this is your intervertebral foramen, the one I have in yellow over here, and you can see your spinal nerves exiting at the intervertebral foramen. By the way, I'm going very quickly for this lecture because it's not really the bulk, and it's pretty much basics, but yeah. Okay, I don't want to make this part too long. So there are two joints that are located in the spine, and these are important because it allows for movement in your neck or in your spine overall. There are two joints. You have the joint that's in between the bodies of the vertebra, and this is the intervertebral disc. This intervertebral disc is a fibrocartilaginous joint. You also have the joint that is in between the superior and inferior articular processes or processes. So this is the inferior articular process, this is the superior articular process, and they join together to form this synovial joint. So the one I have in pink, synovial joint, and over here, blue, intervertebral disc, this is the intervertebral foramen. So let's talk a little bit more about the intervertebral disc. The IV disc has two parts. It has the nucleus pulposus and it has the annulus fibrosus. The nucleus pulposus is a gel-like structure inside in the middle, and it acts as a shock absorber. However, as people age, it gets replaced by fibrous tissue. Around that, you have the annulus fibrosus, and it is a very strong structure that is there mainly to protect, or not protect, but to keep the nucleus pulposus inside. Now, for whatever reason, with age, the annulus fibrosus kind of wears down, And if there is a tear in the annulus fibrosus due to age or any other conditions, then this nucleus pulposus, this gel, would kind of leak out. If this gel leaks out, or if the nucleus pulposus leaks out or herniates laterally, then you would have compression of the spinal nerves. However, if it leaks out or herniates posteriorly, then you would have compression of the spinal cord because it would leak into the vertebral canal. Okay, so let's talk about the spinal cord. The spinal cord has 31 segments, and each segment gives off a pair of spinal nerves, okay? Now you have two fusiform enlargements in your spinal cord. You have the cervical enlargement and you have the lumbosacral enlargement. Why do these enlargements exist? They exist because they would supply the plexus, some or certain plexuses of the body. The cervical enlargement would supply the brachial and the cervical plexus, which would supply your upper limb, and then you have your lumbosacral enlargement that would supply the lumbar plexus, supplying your lower limbs. Now, remember how we said that the spinal cord ends at the level of L1 to L2 in adults. In children, it was level L2 to L3. It ends and it kind of tapers down to form conus medullaris. It's a cone-like structure called conus medullaris. This marks the end of the spinal cord. However, you still need to supply the rest of the body, the lower limbs, right? How would you do that if the spinal cord ends at the level of L1? There is a bundle of descending nerve roots that descend through the vertebral canal, and they split into a pair of spinal nerves at each corresponding vertebra. Now, this bundle of descending nerve roots with the spinal nerves that exit out of them or divide out of them is called the cauda equina. The cauda equina literally just means horsetail in Latin, and it forms this horsetail structure. You can see it looks like a horsetail, right? With the spinal nerves and then the bundle going down. So if there's any injury below this level, below the level of L1 to L2, you would have something called cauda equina syndrome. And cauda equina syndrome, it forms, or doesn't form, it causes saddle anesthesia. From the name, you basically have anesthesia or loss of sensation in the areas where you would use to sit on a saddle, right? That's literally just it. I will go over this a little more, but just know that I will go over this in the spinal lesions lecture, inshallah, or the spinal lesions segment. But know that any injury below the level of L1 to L2 would cause cauda equina syndrome, and it would cause saddle anesthesia, okay? Now, even though the spinal cord is in the vertebral canal, it is still covered by meninges. So the dura and the arachnoid matter, they go all the way down to the S2 level, meaning that the subarachnoid space would exist until this level. Everything below this level is only a layer of pia mater. That is it. So this extension of the pia mater that extends from the conus medullaris all the way down to the tip of the coccyx is called the filum terminal. This is literally just an extension of the pia mater. So what holds the spinal cord in place? What makes sure that it stays in its place? You have two anchors of the spinal cord. You have the pairs of spinal nerves that would exit from the spinal cord at each respective level. And they would exit from the intervertebral foramen, keeping the spinal cord in place. They're holding it in place. You also have the denticulate ligament, and the denticulate ligament is basically, they're triangular structures. These are your denticulate ligaments. They're triangular structures that basically anchor the spinal cord to the dura mater. So when the spinal nerves exit, the pia and the arachnoid mater, they kind of fuse with the dura mater and basically just tethers the spinal cord to the dura mater. It keeps it in place, okay? Okay, so remember how we said that we have 33 vertebra, but we only have 31 spinal segments or pairs of spinal nerves. Let me just remove this. Okay. A general rule of thumb is that all these cervical spinal nerves exit above their corresponding vertebral level. All of them except for C8, okay? C8 exits above the T1 vertebra. All the other cervical vertebra, they exit above their corresponding vertebral level. So for example, you have the C1 spinal nerve over here. It exits above the C1 vertebra. C2 would exit above C2 vertebra. C3 would exit above the C3 vertebra, and so on. However, when it comes to the C8 vertebra, it would exit above the T1 vertebra, not the C8 vertebra, because that doesn't even exist. You only have vertebra up until C7. Now, for everything, all the other spinal nerves that are below the cervical spinal nerves, they all exit below their corresponding vertebra. So T1 exits below the T1 vertebra, T2 spinal nerve exits below the T2 vertebra, and so on. Okay? Now, this table is very, very, very important. Please, 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 I cannot emphasize this enough. It's so high yield. Memorize it like the back of your hand, okay? The vertebral level does not equal the spinal segment. What do I mean by that? I'm not referring to the spinal nerve like exit. We already talked about that over here. I'm referring to the spinal segment that is located behind the vertebra. So, for example, even though the T10 spinal nerve exits below the level of T10, like the T10 vertebra, the T10 spinal segment is located behind the T7 vertebra. So if someone, for example, why is this important to know? If someone gets like stabbed or injured at the level of the T7 vertebra, you want to know which spinal segment corresponds to that, which spinal segment is lying behind that vertebra. You want to know which one is damaged. And this table is basically what helps you with that. It looks complicated, but it's really not, honestly. There's not much that I can help you with. You're just gonna have to spend a little bit of time on it. I'm going to move on because I can't help you much with this, but let's test you on this. So C7, over here, let's see, C7. Cervical vertebra, you add one. So C8, okay? T4, let's see, T4, that is upper thoracic vertebra, so you would add 2, okay? That means T6 spinal, corresponds to the T6 spinal segment. What about T7? You add 3, right? So that corresponds to the T10 spinal segment. T9, you also add 3, so that corresponds to the T12 spinal segment. And lastly, you have T11, that corresponds to the L3 to L4, L3 to L4, yeah, L3 to L4 spinal segment, okay? All right. Now let's talk about the blood supply of the spinal cord. Now, in the spinal cord, there is a fissure that is located anteriorly, known as the anterior median fissure. It's right over here. And there is a sulcus that is located posteriorly that is known as the posterior median sulcus. Now, the anterior median fissure is important because you would have the anterior spinal artery laying inside of it. And the anterior spinal artery is the artery that supplies the entire anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord. So the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord will be supplied by the anterior spinal artery. What about the posterior 1/3 of the spinal cord? What is that going to be supplied by? It is going to be supplied by the 2 posterior spinal arteries. Now, where do these spinal arteries come from? You will take this in your blood supply lecture later, inshallah, but I will go over it very briefly. You have the subclavian artery over here, okay? You have 2 subclavian arteries, and you will have 2 vertebral arteries coming out of them. The vertebral arteries will go all the way up through these cervical vertebra, through which foramen in the cervical vertebra? Yeah, foramen transversarium. Good job. Okay, it goes all the way up, and it enters the foramen magnum, which is the hole in the skull, and then both of these vertebral arteries, they merge on top of the medulla. I think you guys already took this in your intro lecture, but the brainstem is the connection between the cerebrum or the brain and the spinal cord. So it goes brain, brainstem, spinal cord. The brainstem itself is divided into 3 parts. You have the midbrain, you have the pons, and the medulla. So the medulla is the lowermost part of the midbrain. It's the lowermost division of the midbrain. And that is where the vertebral arteries would kind of like merge on top of. All right, they merge together, they become one artery that goes all the way down to supply the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord. And this is what we call the anterior spinal artery. That's how it's formed, by the merging of the 2 vertebral arteries. Now, where do the 2 posterior spinal arteries come from? They also come from the vertebral arteries. They're also branches of them. So all 3 spinal arteries are branches of the vertebral arteries, okay? Time. The 2, by the way, the 2 posterior spinal arteries are located right over here. These are the 2 posterior spinal arteries, and they're located behind the sensory rootlets, or kind of like beside them, laterally to them. Now, you also have intersegmental arteries. These are arteries that would supply the different segments in the spinal cord. But one that I want you to specifically remember is the T8 intersegmental artery. Why is this intersegmental artery important? It is important because it is a direct branch of the aorta. It's also called the artery of Adam Kivich. I don't know how to pronounce it, to be honest, but just recognize it, please, because they can call it whatever. So you need to be able to know what the question is talking about. But if for whatever reason there is occlusion of this artery due to, anything with the aorta or whatever, there would be complete ischemia of the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord. Okay, because it kind of like pulls into the anterior spinal artery. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail in this section, but I will be covering it, inshallah, in the spinal lesions section. But this would cause something called the anterior cord syndrome. Okay, just keep it at the back of your mind now. I also wanted to mention something very quickly. One of the ways that they look at the compression of the spinal nerves is they kind of like inject dye into the subarachnoid space, okay? And then they put that under a radiograph, okay? So they inject this dye through a lumbar puncture and then they take a radiograph. And if they see that the dye is not going through a specific exit point of the spinal nerve, then they would know that that spinal nerve is compressed at that spinal level, okay? So now, you guys already know this from first year, but your spinal nerves have, the spinal nerve is basically like a bundle of axons that's surrounded by 3 different connective tissue layers. Starting with the axon itself, each individual nerve fiber or axon is surrounded by the endoneurium, this layer of connective tissue called the endoneurium. Now, all of these join together to form a fascicle that would be surrounded by the perineurium. The perineurium is important because it forms the blood-nerve barrier. So if this layer is damaged, you would have the nerve function would be severely affected. Lastly, we have the epineurium, and it basically surrounds the entire nerve, and it is there in order to protect it from external injury. Okay, now let's talk about the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is made up of 2 parts. You have the gray matter and you have the white matter. The gray matter is basically, it holds the cell bodies of the, of the neurons in the CNS, and the white matter holds the axons of the neurons in the CNS. Okay, now let's talk about the white matter first. One thing that I want to mention very quickly is that the gray matter is on the inside of the spinal cord, whereas the white matter is on the outside of the spinal cord. This is opposite to the brain, where the gray matter would be located on the outside and the white matter would be located on the inside. Okay, so don't forget, gray matter in, white matter out. Now, sorry. Okay, now the white matter is divided into 3 parts, okay? The area that is in between the anterior median sulcus and the anterior motor rootlets is called the anterior white column, and it's the area that I have in green over here. The area that is in between the motor rootlets and the posterior sensory rootlets is called the lateral white column, and it's the area that I have highlighted in blue. And the area that is in between the posterior median fissure and median fissure or sulcus. Wait, I think it was posterior median fissure. That area is called the posterior white column. Just refer back to what I said in this, where was it? Yeah, in the slide, it was right. Okay. So, what's it called? This area is called the posterior white column. These are important because the ascending and the descending spinal tracts will go through these areas, and we will go over them later, inshallah. Now, let's go back to the gray matter. The gray matter has different horns. So you have the posterior horn, you have the anterior horn, and you have the lateral horn. In specific segments of the spinal cord, we will go over that later. But the anterior horn of the gray matter is what holds the nuclei of the motor neurons of the spinal cord, or sorry, of the CNS. And then in the what's it called, posterior horn, you would have the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Okay. What else do we have here? Okay. Now, Here you would have the motor or the anterior rootlets, and then here you would have the posterior or sensory rootlets, okay? These would join to become roots. So let's start with the dorsal rootlets. Dorsal rootlets become the dorsal roots, and then this dorsal root becomes the dorsal root ganglion. Now, what is the dorsal root ganglion? What does it contain? The dorsal root ganglion would contain the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. And what type of neurons are they? Yes, pseudounipolar neurons. I hope you answered that correctly. So you have the dorsal root here, and you have the ventral root here. You don't have a ventral root ganglion. You guys should know this already from first year. I'm going over this very quickly. But the dorsal root and the ventral root, they would join to form the spinal nerve. This makes the spinal nerve a mixed nerve. So it has both sensory components and motor components. The spinal nerve exits from the intervertebral foramen, and it divides into the ventral ramus and the dorsal ramus. The dorsal primary ramus, they have a posterior or the dorsal primary rami, that's the plural of it. It contains, what was I going to say? Yeah, sorry. It divides into the posterior branches and the medial branches, and these would supply the muscles of the back and the skin over the neck. For your ventral ramus, you would have anterior and lateral branches. Yeah, you would have anterior and lateral cutaneous branches, I think. Yes, you do. This is posterior and medial. This is anterior and lateral cutaneous branches. These would supply the rest of the body wall. Also, another thing that I want you to keep in mind for the ventral ramus is that it forms or it provides the roots of certain or various nerve plexuses. And this is important to note. There was one more thing I wanted to mention. Yes, T2 to T12 do not form plexuses. So keep that in mind. Ventral ramus forms nerve plexuses. Okay, this is pretty easy, but dermatome is the area of skin that is supplied by a single spinal nerve or a spinal segment, and myotome is a group of muscles that would be supplied by a single spinal nerve or nerve segment. Okay, now let's talk about how each section of the spinal cord would look like. So starting with the cervical section, you would see that the white matter is a lot, right? And why is that? That is because the white matter adds on from the bottom up. So once you start from the bottom, you can see that the sacral segment over here, it barely has white matter because the white matter adds on as you go on top to the top of the spinal cord. That is why at the cervical level, you would have a lot of white matter. You will also see that the anterior gray horn here is very, very big. And that is because this would contain the motor cell bodies of the neurons that would supply the plexuses. So here you have the cervical and you have the brachial plexuses that would supply the upper limbs, and that is why you have a large anterior gray horn. Now, in the thoracic segment, a distinguishing feature about it, you can easily tell it apart from all the other segments because of the lateral horn. The lateral horn, what would it contain? What's it called? The lateral horn would contain the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. And you can also see that the anterior horn barely has what's it called? It barely has anything. It's very small, and that is because there aren't many motor signals that you need to send in the thorax. You mainly just need to supply the thoracic muscles, but you don't really have any upper limbs or lower limbs to supply. Okay, so distinguishing feature is the lateral horn that contains the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Okay, let's go down to the lumbar segment. So the lumbar segment, you will see that the white matter is a lot less. So as you go down, the white matter starts to decrease. So compared to the cervical segment, you will see that it is a lot smaller. But you will see that the anterior horn is a lot bigger, right? Compared to the thoracic one. Why is that? Because it supplies the lower limbs, the lower plexus, and so you need a lot of anterior horn because it contains the cell bodies of the motor neurons, okay? Lastly, we have the sacrum. We have the sacral segment, and you will see that it barely has any white matter, again, because we start from the bottom, and so you barely have any white matter in this area. It only increases as you go up. So you can see that the gray horn or the gray matter is a lot more in comparison, okay? I think this is everything that I wanted to mention for that section. Okay, Next, we have the gray matter. Let's talk a little bit more about that. We will be talking about the gray matter nuclei. So starting with the posterior gray horn cells. I know this slide looks like it's a lot, but it's really not. But it will be easier for you when everything is in one place. I really like this. I really like this table. Okay, so the posterior gray horn cells, they contain columns of gray matter. Some of them extend throughout the entire length of the spinal cord, whereas some of them only extend or are only located in specific areas of the spinal cord. We will go through each of them one by one. You will start with the substantia gelatinosa over here. And the substantia gelatinosa extends throughout the entire segment or the entire length of the spinal cord. It is responsible for pain, temperature, and touch sensations, specifically crude touch sensations. Now, what is the difference between crude and fine touch? I'm going to explain these very briefly. My explanation of them isn't going to be the best because I know you guys already took this in your physiology lectures, but the difference between crude touch and fine touch is that crude touch, you can't really localize where the pressure is or where the touch is. You can just tell that there's pressure there. However, in fine touch, you can localize it. You can know exactly where it is. You can tell the texture of it. You can tell how much pressure is being applied. That is the difference between crude touch and fine touch. Fine touch, you will find it in the more sensitive areas of the body, like your fingertips, whereas crude touch, you will find it in the other parts of your body, like your shoulder, for example, right? Because you only need to know if there's pressure or not. That's it. Okay. Next, we have the nucleus purpureus. It also extends throughout the entire length of the spinal cord. It is responsible for two-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception. Now, what does two-touch discrimination mean? Honestly, it's exactly from the name. It's basically being able to discriminate or perceive that you have two distinct stimuli or two distinct areas of the skin that are being that have pressure on them. Okay, and it's basically a test where you can tell the distance in between. I don't know how to explain this properly, but the difference is that in some areas of your body, like muscle on your hand, the difference or the distance in between these 2 points can be perceived easily, whereas the distance would increase as you go to other parts of the body, like again, your shoulder. It will be the distance in between these 2 points where you can perceive that they're two different points gets bigger. However, on your fingertips, you can tell, or your hands, you can tell that the distance gets smaller, okay, as you get to more sensitive parts of the body. I didn't explain that too well, but I know you guys already took this in physiology, so it's okay. I just wanted to cover it for completion. Conscious proprioception. What is proprioception? Proprioception is basically just being able to tell where you are. So it's like spatial awareness, like knowing where you are in space. And what's it called? Yeah, you have two types of proprioception. You have conscious proprioception and unconscious proprioception. The difference between them is that conscious proprioception is basically when, let's say you want to get a mug, right? You're heading for the mug, you want to drink some coffee. You don't think about how far away your hand is or how far away the mug is. You just go and grab the mug and you drink from it. And then you put it back, right? You don't think about how far away your hand is. You don't think about this. You just head for it, you take it, you drink, you put it back. When there's overshoot or undershoot, basically not being able to tell exactly how much distance you need to cover, that is what we call a problem with conscious proprioception, okay? Unconscious proprioception is basically your awareness of your body position, honestly. So whenever you're walking, you don't think about how far away your feet are from the floor. You just start walking, right? So this is what unconscious proprioception is. Okay, next we have the dorsal nucleus or the Clark's column. The Clark's column doesn't extend throughout the entire length of the spinal cord. It only extends from the level of C8 to L3, L4, and is responsible for unconscious proprioception. We already talked about this. Now, for the lateral horn, we will talk about the lateral nucleus now. This is called the intermediolateral nucleus. This one extends from the level of T1 to L2, and it gives rise to preganglionic sympathetic fibers, just like we mentioned in the lateral horn. Next, we have the anterior gray horn nuclei. You have three groups that have different functions depending on where you are in the body. Now, honestly, to be completely honest with you, I personally just memorized the cervical region. And I was more than five, to be honest with you. But to be safe, I would say that you should memorize all of them. But personally, I just memorized this. But you should not do that. You should probably memorize the rest of them. But I think you would be fine if you just memorize this, to be honest with you. Okay? Not much that I can do for you here. I would just be reading it out loud, so I'm just going to move on. You can spend some time on this and memorize it. Okay, questions. So, I'm going to move on very quickly. Please pause in order to answer them. Okay, T6, we said we would add 2, so T8. Very simple. Okay, cauda equina. Why? Because we said from the level, anything below the level of L1 to L2, you would risk damage to the cauda equina. And this was at the level of L4. Okay, we said that the anterior rami of spinal nerves would form the plexuses, right, in your body. And this is literally, this question is very direct. They're very easy questions. Okay, so now we will be going over the ascending tracks, inshallah. This is like everything after this part is the main bulk of this part, inshallah. So all tracts, they live within the white matter. Why? Because they're bundles of axons. So the ascending, let's say, for example, that you touch something hot, okay? You would sense that you are touching something hot. These sensations would go up through your spinal cord. It would go to the brain, and then they would go down the spinal cord as descending tracts in order to allow you or give you an order to move your hand, right? It would send a signal to the muscles to move your hand, right? So the white matter, all of these tracts is they're how the sensation reaches the brain and how the movement commands reach the muscle. Okay, طيب. You have two types, as we said, ascending tracts and descending tracts. The ascending tracts are sensory because you would send the signals up, and then the descending tracts are motor because the signals go down the spinal cord. Okay, fine. Now, you need to memorize all of these. These tracks are very, very important. But inshallah, yani, by the end of the spa, you will be able to recognize them or just say them very, very easily. They'll come easily to you, yani, inshallah. طيب. You have the ascending tracts, you have three of them, dorsal columns, the spinothalamic tract, and the spinocerebellar tract. There are other tracts, but you don't really need to remember them. Then for the descending tracts, you would have the corticospinal tract or the pyramidal tract, okay? To remember which ones are the ascending tracts and which ones are the descending tracts, you can break down the word. So dorsal columns are easy, okay? You will easily know that they're ascending tracts. But spinothalamic, spino starts from the spine, goes all the way to the thalamus. So it starts from the bottom up, from the spine to the thalamus. Spinocerebellar, same concept, starts from the spine, goes to the cerebellum. So these are ascending. They go from up to down, from bottom up, okay? Descending tracts, you have the corticospinal tract. Corticospinal, meaning you start from the cortex, you go down all the way to the spine. So corticospinal descending tract, okay? Fine. This is a very, very, very important slide. You need to know this. Like, it needs to come so easy to you, inshallah. Why? Because different sensations, they travel in different tracts. And any damage in them would produce selective sensory loss. So the different tracts will allow you to localize which lesions or where the lesions happen. Okay, this is very, very important for from the clinical aspect. All right, so we will start with the dorsal columns. Bismillah. So for the dorsal columns, we have two dorsal columns. We have fasciculus gracilis and we have fasciculus cunatus. The dorsal columns are responsible for two-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception. All right. These two, we will start with fasciculus gracilis, okay? Fasciculus gracilis is the one that carries information from the lower parts of the body, and it will be present throughout the entire length of the spinal cord. However, fasciculus cunatus will be only present in specific areas of the body, or sorry, in specific areas of the spinal cord, so from level C1 to T6. Why? Because it carries sensation from the upper limb, all right? So it's not throughout the entire body, it's just when it comes up to the upper limb, it starts to exist, okay? So how do I remember which one supplies the lower limb and which one carries, which one carries sensation from the lower limb and which one carries sensation from the upper limb? There's this muscle in the leg that's called gracilis. And so that's honestly how I remember it. It's a muscle in the leg, gracilis. So fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. How do you remember which one is medial and which one is lateral in the spinal cord? When you start down, you would have your lower limbs, right? So you go down, up, so you have it medially. As you go up, the sensations from the upper limb, they would add up laterally, okay? This is the best way I can explain it for you guys. I hope that makes sense. طيب. Next, what do we have? We want to talk about the spinothalamic tract. Now, the spinal thalamic tract is made up of two parts. You have the lateral spinothalamic tract and you have the anterior spinothalamic tract. The anterior spinothalamic tract is responsible for crude touch and pressure sensations, whereas the lateral spinothalamic tract is responsible for carrying pain and temperature sensations, okay? From the bottom up, of course. طيب. What do I want to mention about this? I think we are good for here. طيب. Lastly, we have the spinocerebellar pathway. The spinocerebellar pathway is responsible for unconscious proprioception. What's it called? You don't really need to remember these too much. I will explain them later, but just know spinocerebellar responsible for unconscious proprioception. So in the anterior column, what do we have? We have the anterior spinothalamic tract. Lateral column, we have the lateral spinothalamic tract, and we have the spinocerebellar pathways. And in the dorsal column, very easy, you have the two dorsal columns or the medial lemniscal pathways. Okay. I think we're good, inshallah. Okay. So, a general rule for all ascending tracts, for all sensory pathways, they are made up of three order neurons. Okay. The first order neuron is located it's always located in the dorsal root ganglion. Okay. So you don't need to think about this. Your first order neurons, the cell bodies of them will always be located in the dorsal root ganglion. The second order neurons, these first order neurons would then synapse with the second order neurons. These second order neurons, their location depends on the tract. Okay, we will talk about each one in detail, inshallah, but can either be located in the posterior gray horn over here or in the medulla. Lastly, you have the third order neurons. Okay, these are the what's it called, the rules for the ascending tracts. Okay, so let's start with the dorsal column. We said that in all of the sensory pathways, we have the first order neurons in the dorsal root ganglion. Specifically, you have the pseudo-unipolar cell body, okay? That is in the dorsal root ganglion, okay? So let's say, let's talk about the functions of the dorsal column, just to remember them. We have the two-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception sensations, okay? So let's say that you send vibrations down to the lower limbs of, a patient, okay? What is going to happen? These sensations will go through the axon, they will go through the pseudounipolar neuron, and then they will go to the dorsal root ganglion. This is where your first order neurons are. This is your first order neuron. The cell body of it is located in the dorsal root ganglion. It's always in the dorsal root ganglion, okay? First order neuron goes here, and then the axons of this first order neuron goes all the way up ipsilaterally. It doesn't synapse anywhere. It directly goes up in the spinal cord, but it goes through the dorsal horn and it goes all the way up to the medulla, okay? Please remember this. No synapse happens at the level of the spinal cord in the dorsal column pathway, okay? Sorry, let me just zoom in. Okay, so we said that it would go all the way up to the medulla. Where does it go? By the way, specifically here, the pathway that we're talking about is the gracilis. So fasciculus gracilis is over here because you're carrying sensations from the lower limb, right? So fasciculus gracilis goes all the way up and it goes and synapses with the second order neurons in the gracile nucleus. It makes sense. These are very easy to memorize. Because the gracilis tract or the fasciculus gracilis, it would go and it would synapse in the gracilis nucleus, whereas the fasciculus cuneatus or the cunate tract, it would synapse in the cunate nucleus, okay? So back to where the axons of the first order cell body at the level of the medulla, specifically where? In the gracile nucleus. That's in my internet connection is unstable. I hope I didn't lag. But I was saying that the axons of the first order neurons, they go all the way up to synapse with the cell body of the second order neurons at the level of the medulla. Where specifically? The gracile nucleus. This is for the gracilis, fasciculus gracilis, or the gracile tract. However, for the fasciculus cuneatus tract, or the cunate tract, it goes and it synapses with its second order neuron cell body, also at the level of the medulla, but specifically at the cunate nucleus. All right. So, what happens after the synapse? The axons of the second order neurons, they would cross the midline. Would they cross the midline? They would cross it at the medulla. Okay, remember this, very important. They cross at the level of the medulla. These fibers, these fibers are called internal arcuate fibers. The fibers that cross the midline are called internal arcuate fibers. These fibers then collect together and they ascend medially. Okay, they ascend medially in the brainstem. And they form a tract called the medial lemniscal tract. So these fibers will then collect, they will bundle up, and they will form the medial lemniscal tract. This medial lemniscal tract, it would ascend upwards medially in the brainstem. And then it would go to the VPL thalamic nuclei. VPL stands for ventroposterior lateral nucleus, and it is located in the thalamus. Order neurons, specifically the cell bodies of the third order neurons, okay? So this is where the second synapse happens. First synapse between the first order neurons and the second order neurons happens at the level of the medulla. Second synapse between the second order neurons and the third order neurons happens at the level of the thalamus, okay? Then the axons of this third order neuron goes all the way up to the postcentral gyrus, which is also called the somatosensory cortex, where it would relay the sensory information. Okay, I hope that made sense for you guys. I will go over it a bunch of times, inshallah, to make sure that it sticks and it makes sense. 1 second. Okay, so this is everything that I said in words. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. Now, we will be going over this diagram again in order to make sure that this concept sticks with us. So let me just, okay. So let's say that you have sensations that are coming. Which sensations in specific? We said two-touch discrimination, vibrations, and conscious proprioception. It's coming from the lower part of the body. It's going in. The sensations are going in. And then you would have the cell body of the first order neuron over here. Okay. Then the axons of these first order neurons, they would go through the posterior horn, and then they would go all the way up ipsilaterally and the same side. They don't cross, okay? They don't cross. They go all the way up to the medulla, okay? Where do they synapse with the second order neurons? At the level of the medulla, specifically in the gracile nucleus, because we're talking about the gracilis fasciculus or the fasciculus gracilis, okay? Then what is going to happen at this level? You will have decussation. I forgot to mention that. But when the fibers cross to the across the midline, at the level of the medulla, we call this decussation. So this crossing of the fibers is called decussation. So there would be decussation of these fibers, and this would form the internal arcuate fibers over here. They would join together, they would bundle up, and they would go through the medial part of the brainstem. Okay, goes all the way up until it gets to the VPL of the thalamus, ventroposterior lateral thalamic nucleus. Okay, it goes all the way there. What are you going to find there? You're going to find the cell body of the third order neuron. Okay, the axons of the third order neuron will then go all the way up to the somatosensory cortex or the postcentral gyrus in order to relay the sensation. Just to emphasize, I'm going to go over it again, but from the sensations from the upper body. Let's say that there's the sensation proprioception, okay, conscious proprioception goes from here, okay? Then you would have your first order, the cell body of the first order neuron in the dorsal root ganglion, goes all the way up, and then it synapses with the second order neuron at the cunate nucleus at the level of the medulla, okay? Then you would have decussation, sorry. You would have decussation or the crossing of the fibers to the contralateral side, so across the midline, goes all the way up, bundles up with the other pathway, and then you would have the medial lemniscus, okay? This tract goes all the way up medially to the VPL of the thalamus, where you would find the cell bodies of the third order neurons, okay? Then you just have the somatosensory cortex. I hope that made sense, inshallah. Right. Now, what happens if you have a lesion in this tract, okay? Now, let's say that there is a lesion at this level, at X, okay? At this level, would you have ipsilateral loss of true-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception, or would it be contralateral? I know it's here, but pretend you don't see it, okay? It would be ipsilateral loss. Why is it ipsilateral? Because it is still below the level of the crossing, of the decussation. The fibers still did not cross the midline. And so everything below this part will still be ipsilateral. So you would lose everything, not everything, sorry. You would lose the sensations that we talked about below this level of the lesion, okay? It would be ipsilateral. Like, what if the damage or the lesion is located at the level of the medulla, or above the medulla, and specifically the tract that was affected, okay? What is going to happen? Is this ipsilateral loss or contralateral loss below the level of the lesion? Contralateral loss, right? So if there is damage to the left side, to the left medial lemniscus, then you would have loss of sensations in the right part, right? You would have loss of sensation in the right part of the spinal cord, okay? Below the level of the lesion. And that is because at this point, the fibers have already crossed the midline. So it makes sense, inshallah. Okay. Now, we're going to be talking about the spinal thalamic tract. The functions of the spinal thalamic tract laterally, or the lateral spinal thalamic tract, I forgot to add pain here, but it's pain and temperature sensations. Anteriorly, you have crude touch and pressure sensations, okay? So let's say that you touch something hot, for the temperature sensations, okay? It would go through, and then you would have your first order neuron. Where would you find the cell body of the first order neuron? Always in the dorsal root ganglion, in all of the tracts, okay? Now, let me just zoom in. Okay, so you would have, what's it called? The first order neuron, it would go into the dorsal root ganglion, and then the axons of these first order neurons, they would synapse, they would go into the dorsal horn, and they would synapse at the level of the spinal cord. They would synapse with the second order neuron at the level of the spinal cord. Unlike the other tract, where the synapse happened at the level of the medulla, remember? The synapse here between the first order neuron and the second order neuron happens at the level of the spinal cord, specifically in substantia gelatinosa. Okay, if you guys remember it, it was responsible for pain, temperature, sensations. And so it goes dorsal horn, specifically which nucleus? We talked about it. It's substantia gelatinosa, okay? So where would you find the cell bodies of the second order neuron? You would find it in substantia gelatinosa in the posterior horn. Okay. Now, the axons of the second order neuron, then they would cross the midline at the level of the spinal cord. So the crossing here happens at the level of the spinal cord, whereas over here in the dorsal tract, or sorry, in the medial lemniscal tract, it happened at the level of the medulla, okay? Here it happens at the level of the spinal cord. So it's going to cross, and this crossing over here, these fibers, we call them the anterior commissural fibers, okay? But remember this, it's important later on in the spinal lesions. Please, like, remember it for now, okay? So the fibers that cross at the level of the spinal cord, specifically the spinal thalamic tract, like fibers, when they cross across the spinal cord, they would form the anterior commissural fibers, okay? Okay. Now, they're going to cross, and hold on, I just want to explain something. So here we said that it was temperature, right? And which pathway carries the temperature sensations is the lateral spinothalamic pathway or tract, okay? So pain and temperature sensations, let's say that these neurons are carrying pain and temperature sensations, right? They would go all the way over here, and then they would go up laterally because they're forming the lateral spinothalamic tract. However, if it's carrying crude touch and pressure sensations, this neuron would go to the anterior column, and then it would descend upwards anteriorly, okay? In the specific case, though, it's going laterally because of the pain and temperature sensations, all right? Fine. So we said that the fibers that are carrying the pain and temperature sensations, they form the lateral spinothalamic tract, and then they go lateral in the lateral white column. Sorry, in the lateral white column. Whereas the fibers that are carrying the crude touch and the pressure sensations, they would form the anterior spinothalamic tract, and they would go to the anterior column, and they would ascend anteriorly. Both of these tracts, when they get to the medulla, they form the spinal lemniscal tract. It's also called the lateral lemniscus. Why is it called that? Because it ascends laterally in the brainstem. Okay, unlike which tract are we talking about? The dorsal column tract. Unlike the medial lemniscal tract, where the medial lemniscus would ascend medially. All right, sorry. They would ascend all the way to the VPL of the thalamus. Again, what would you find in the VPL of the thalamus? You would find the cell bodies of third order neurons, and then the axons go all the way up to the cortex, specifically where? Postcentral gyrus, somatosensory cortex, to relay the sensory information. Okay, I hope that was clear. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, I think we're good, inshallah. Time. Let's go over it again very quickly. So, pain and temperature sensation goes dorsal root ganglion. You would find the cell bodies of the first order neuron. Goes to the dorsal horn. That is where you would find the substantia gelatinosa. What would you find inside of it? You would find the cell bodies of the second order neurons. So the synapse happened at this level, at the level of the spinal cord, in the substantia gelatinosa nucleus. Okay, so the synapse would happen over here. Then the axons of the second order neurons, they would go to the contralateral side. They would cross to the contralateral side. And what do we call these fibers? Anterior commissural communicating fibers. I think that's what they were called. Okay, now you go all the way up, because these are pain and temperature sensations. They would form the lateral spinothalamic pathway, and it would go laterally in the lateral column, goes all the way up until it gets to the brainstem, and it goes laterally until the VPL, until the VPL of the thalamus, where you would find third order neurons, the cell bodies of third order neurons, that would go all the way up. If we're talking about, imagine this is in pain and temperature, imagine that it says crude touch and, what was it? It was crude touch and pressure sensations. Yeah, okay. Crude touch and pressure sensations. Let's say it goes here. First order neuron, second order neuron. Axons cross, they move all the way up, but anteriorly. So in the anterior column, go up to the thalamus. This would be the lateral lemniscus. Goes all the way up to the VPL of the thalamus, third order neuron cell bodies, and then you would have the cortex. Okay. So, now, what happens if there is a lesion to or any damage to the spinothalamic tract? Okay, any damage to the spinothalamic tract would always be contralateral. Okay, yeah, any sensations below this lesion would be contralateral. Why? Because it already crosses at the level of the spinal cord. So anything below this level would be contralateral. So if we cut it over here, the lateral spinothalamic tract, you would have contralateral loss of pain and temperature below this level, because it already crossed at the level of the spinal cord. You don't need to reach up to the medulla. Okay? I hope that was clear. Just to help compare them, the blue one over here is the medial lemniscal pathway. This is the what was it called? This is the spinal lemniscal pathway. Okay, so the medial lemniscal pathway, you get sensations over here, dorsal root ganglion, goes without synapsing, goes up ipsilaterally up until it gets to the medulla. That's where you would have the synapse between the first and the second order neurons. Here you would find the cell bodies of the second order neurons, internal arcuate fibers. This is your medial lemniscus. It bundles up, goes all the way up to the VPL of the thalamus, and then boom, you have the cortex. Okay. This is the spinal lemniscal pathway. Okay, so you would have the sensations, they go over here. Which sensations specifically were for the medial lemniscus? Two-touch discrimination, yes, conscious proprioception, and two-touch discrimination, conscious proprioception, and vibrations. Whereas for this one, it was pain, temperature for the lateral pathways, whereas for the anterior pathways, it was crude touch and pressure, okay? So it goes here. You have your dorsal root ganglion. You would have the second order neurons. The synapse would happen at the level of the spinal cord, specifically where? Which nucleus? Substantia gelatinosa. Then you would have the crossing over here, anterior commissural fibers. They go all the way up as the spinal lemniscal pathway, BPL cortex. I hope that was clear. I repeated it a lot just to make sure that the concept sticks with you guys. So, lastly, we have the spinocerebellar tract. One thing that I want to mention about the spinocerebellar tract is that it never reaches the cortex because it's spinocerebellar, so it's from the spine to the cerebellum, and that's why you only have two order neurons. You don't have one of them. You have the first order, you don't have three of them. You have the first order neurons and the second order neurons. That's it. What was the function of the spinocerebellar tract? It was unconscious proprioception. طيب. Okay, so let's go over it very quickly. You have two spinocerebellar tracts. We will start with the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. So you have your first order neurons, again, in the dorsal root ganglion. In the dorsal root ganglion, you would get the cell bodies and then the axons of the first order neuron, synapses with the axons, with the cell body of the second order neuron. Which nucleus exactly? Clark's nucleus. If you guys remember, it was responsible for unconscious proprioception, okay? So Clark's nucleus, and then the axons of the second order neurons go all the way up to the cerebellum, and then they go here, okay? This one is simple because it's ipsilateral. It goes up ipsilateral على طول. But for the ventral spinocerebellar tract, it's different, okay? You would have dorsal root ganglion, first order neurons, and then there would be the synapse at, again, Clark's nucleus. And then they would cross the midline. The axons of the second order neurons would cross the midline. And then they ascend contralaterally until they get to the cerebellum. They enter the cerebellum and then they cross again to the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. So it ends up in the same position anyway. It ends up in the same position where you got the sensor information from, okay? So it's very, very simple. The spinocerebellar tract is very simple. There will always be ipsilateral loss of unconscious proprioception because for both of the tracts, it always ends up ipsilateral anyway, even if it crosses twice. So what are the key features of the spinocerebellar tract? You would have double decussation, so it crosses twice. You would have lesions that produce ipsilateral deficits, and there are no third order neurons, okay? Fine. These are the accessory sensor tracts. Honestly, I didn't memorize them. I just knew a thing or two about them. So I would recommend just, quickly going over them, but you don't have to memorize them. There are no questions about them. Inshallah, there won't be, but they're not really important to know, inshallah. Questions? I'll go over this quickly. Please pause whenever you would like. Okay, so why is this loss of vibration sensation in the toes? It says over here that the medial portion of the dorsal columns, okay? So dorsal columns, what were they responsible for? To touch discrimination, vibration, unconscious proprioception. The medial portion was that the fasciculus gracilis or fasciculus cuneatus, that was gracilis. And gracilis was responsible for carrying sensations from upper limb or lower limbs? Lower limbs. So you would have loss of vibration in the lower limbs. You can remove this one, you can remove this one because they're upper limb, and you would not really be stuck, but you would have these two options. Of course, it's vibration, not crude touch. What was crude touch? Yes, it would be the spinothalamic. Okay, this is the spinocerebellar tract. Why? Unconscious proprioception. Very simple. Okay. Why is this the caudal medulla? Because over here it's talking about two-point discrimination, okay? Where would you find two-point discrimination? Dorsal tract. Specifically, what was it called? Medial lemniscal tract, okay? The medial lemniscal tract, where did it decussate? At the level of the medulla, not the spinal cord, okay? Specifically, where? The caudal medulla, which is the lower part of the medulla, okay? We're done with ascending, time to move on to descending. Okay, now we will be talking about the descending tracts. So we will be talking about how the brain actually makes your muscles move, how you initiate movements. So the voluntary muscles that are below the head and neck are all supplied by the corticospinal tract. All the voluntary muscles that are above the head and neck are supplied by the corticobulbar tract. That is not our concern. It will be discussed in the brainstem lecture. But do know that the corticospinal tract will supply all the voluntary muscles that are below the head and neck. The most important part, or the most important concept that you should know from the slide is that the corticospinal tract is composed of two components, the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons. Whenever I'm referring to the upper motor neurons, I'm referring to the corticospinal tract. They're basically the same exact thing. So let's start with the upper motor neuron. Let's say you want to initiate a movement. You want to go grab something. You want to grab a cup, okay? What is going to happen? The initiation of the movement will come from the cortex, specifically the cell bodies that are located in the cerebral cortex. What is going to happen? The axons of these upper motor neurons from the cell bodies that are located in the cerebral cortex, they will descend down. And these axons will all bundle up together as one and form the corticospinal tract. This corticospinal tract, it will descend all the way downwards until it reaches the spinal cord. Once it gets there, it will go specifically to the anterior gray horn to synapse with the lower motor neurons. The cell bodies of the lower motor neurons are located in the anterior gray horn. One thing I want to mention quickly is that the upper motor neurons do not innervate the muscles directly. Their only job is to synapse with the lower motor neurons in order to influence them. The lower motor neurons are the ones that directly innervate the muscles and influence them. All right. So let's talk about the lower motor neurons now. After the corticospinal tract went all the way down to synapse with the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons located in the anterior gray horn, once the lower motor neuron is activated, its axons will exit the spinal cord. Through where? Through the ventral roots. And it becomes a part of the spinal nerve, the mixed nerve, okay? And then after it does that, it will travel all the way down, or it will travel out into the body, into the skeletal muscles. And then it would cause the muscle contraction, okay? That's it for this part. Now, the corticospinal tract doesn't just release signals whenever it wants. It is modulated and modified by input from both the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. So whenever you want to initiate a movement, the initiation of the movement, as we mentioned before, comes from the cortex, and the cerebellum would get activated. What does it do? It activates in order to make sure that the movement that is initiated is corrected. We want to make sure that this movement is smooth and it's coordinated, right? That's the purpose of the cerebellum. So we mentioned what the cerebellum does. What does the basal ganglia do? At rest, there are constant external stimuli that are going to the brain that are trying to initiate movement, involuntary movements that we don't want. What does the basal ganglia do? It inhibits this involuntary movement or these external stimuli that we don't want, because we don't want any involuntary movements to happen. It just prevents it, okay? If something goes wrong with the basal ganglia, you could have two problems. You could either get Parkinson's or bad الشر عليكم. You get the point. Parkinson's can happen or Huntington's can happen. Parkinson's happens when there's an increase in the inhibition that comes from the basal ganglia. What would this result in? The initiation of the movement from the cortex becomes more difficult, okay? What happens in Huntington's? There would be a decrease in the inhibitory signals that come from the basal ganglia. This means that there would be a bunch of involuntary movements that we don't want just happening, all right? We said that the initiation of the movement comes from the cortex, specifically from these areas in the cortex. Just memorize them for now. They will make more sense to you, inshallah, after you take the cortex lecture. Because this is a motor tract, we said that the tract would start at the cortex, okay? Let me zoom in. So the corticospinal tract arises from the areas of the cortex that we talked about. It arises from there, and then it goes through a structure in the brain called the internal capsule, all right? Then it goes and passes through the ventral part of the midbrain and the pons, all right? Until it reaches the medulla, specifically the caudal medulla. When it reaches the caudal medulla, 85 to 90% of the fibers of this tract, they would cross the midline. So these are the 85 to 90% of the fibers. They go down and they decussate. This decussation is called the pyramidal decussation. when these fibers cross the midline, they form pyramids on the top of the medulla. And that's why we call this tract the pyramidal tract as well. Okay? So now we mentioned that 85% to 85 to 90% of these fibers would cross. What do they do later? They go down in the lateral column. They go all the way down as the lateral corticospinal tract until they reach the level of the spinal cord. Now we said that we want them to synapse with the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons, right? Where were they located? They were located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Okay, so they would synapse with the contralateral side. So it starts here but ends here on the contralateral side. Okay, so what happens to the rest of the 10% to 10 to 15% of the fibers that didn't cross at the level of the medulla? They go straight down, but instead of going through the lateral column, they go through the anterior column, and they descend as the anterior corticospinal tract until they reach the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. And then once they get there, they don't synapse with the ipsilateral one. They go and cross the midline to synapse with the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons that are located on the contralateral gray horn, or located in the contralateral gray horn. So even though they go down ipsilaterally, when they get to the spinal cord level, they also cross the midline. So technically, both of them end up in the same position. All right. Then the axons of the lower motor neuron would go and directly innervate the muscles. I hope that was clear. All right. This is basically the same thing that I already mentioned. I could go over it again very quickly over here. So you would have the input, you would start the movement over here, and then it goes all the way down it goes in the ventral part of the midbrain, ventral part of the pons, and it goes to the caudal medulla. It forms the pyramids in the medulla by the pyramidal decussation, and then 95%, sorry, not 95%, 85 to 90% of the fibers cross the midline. They go all the way down through the lateral column, and they would go and synapse with the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons in the anterior gray horn. What about the remaining 10 to 15%? They descend downwards from the medulla. They don't cross the midline at the level of the medulla, but they go downwards through the anterior column, and they go all the way down until they get to the spinal cord. What do they do when they get to the spinal cord? They cross the midline, and they synapse with the cell bodies in the contralateral side of the lower motor neuron. Okay, same thing over here. I'm not going to go over it again. Okay, so just one concept that I want to get out of the way quickly so that you guys don't get confused. If the upper motor neuron is going to supply the muscles of the head and neck, it needs to synapse with a lower motor neuron in the brainstem. That is not our issue. Okay, put that to the side. What we're talking about is below the head and neck. So below the head and neck, there needs to be a synapse in the anterior gray horn, right? Now, the role of the upper motor neuron is to inhibit the lower motor neuron. I told you guys this earlier, but we said that the upper motor neuron, its only function is to influence the lower motor neuron. It does not directly innervate the muscles. The lower motor neuron is the one that directly innervates the muscle. Okay, fine. So if this motor neuron is damaged, what is going to happen? There would be an increase in the tone and the spasticity. Why is that? Because the lower motor neuron is constantly sending signals on its own. It can cause the muscle to keep contracting all the time. If the upper motor neuron isn't there to inhibit it, then the lower motor neuron will do whatever it wants, and so you would have increase in the tone of the muscle, and you would have increased spasticity. Okay? Right. What is going to happen if the lower motor neuron is the one that is damaged? We said that the lower motor neuron is the one that directly innervates the muscles. So if there's no innervation to the muscles, what is going to happen? The muscle isn't going to contract at all. So you'd have flaccid paralysis, you would have loss of tone, and because there's no innervation going to the muscle at all, over time you will have muscle atrophy because it's not working, it's not contracting. So it's going to atrophy. Okay? Fine. So we mentioned that damage to the corticospinal tract or the upper motor neuron, it's the same thing. Damage to the corticospinal tract would cause or would result in spastic paralysis. But is it contralateral or is it ipsilateral? Let's talk about this here. 1 second. Okay, so if there is damage above the level of the medulla, so let's say over here, if there is damage above the level of the medulla, this would cause spastic paralysis. Why? Because the fibers didn't cross the midline yet. So, spastic paralysis on the contralateral side. Why is that? Because they didn't cross the midline. So at this point, if the right side of the the upper motor neuron is damaged above the medulla, then this whole side, the left side, would be affected. Okay? طيب. What if the damage to the corticospinal tract is below the level of the medulla? So over here, okay, lateral corticospinal tract. It's below the level of the medulla. What is going to happen? You would have ipsilateral spasticity, right? Increase in tone and spasticity. Because at this point, there was already, like the pyramidal decussation already happened. خلاص, like they already crossed and there are already, on the ipsilateral side, okay? طيب. Now, we talked about the damage to the upper motor neuron. So we talked about upper motor neuron lesions. I don't know why I zoomed out. Let's talk about the lower motor neuron lesions, okay? What happens if there is damage to the lower motor neuron? What would happen? Let's say that this is the segment of damage, this blue part, okay? These are the lower motor neurons. At the segment of damage, how are you going to have damage to the lower motor neurons? We said that the lower motor neurons are located in the anterior gray horn. So if the anterior gray horn is damaged, you would have damage to the lower motor neurons, okay? We said that if the lower motor neuron is damaged, then there will be no innervation to the muscles. So you would have flaccid paralysis, atrophy, loss of tone, everything that we talked about at that same level. All right. So at the same level, because there's damage to the anterior horn and the lower motor neurons, you would have lower motor neuron symptoms. Okay. Okay. What about the levels below it? So let's say this part, the lower motor neuron over here. Below the segment of the damage, there would be upper motor neuron damage. Why is that? Because the corticospinal tract still didn't get to this part. Is the anterior horn here damaged? No, the anterior horn is damaged over here. It means that the corticospinal tract was cut off at this area. It never got to get down to this lower part of the spinal cord. And so this part never got upper motor neuron like influence. So the lower motor neuron started to do whatever it wanted, and it resulted in hyperreflexia and the spastic paralysis that we talked about. Okay? All right. Now, this is kind of everything that I said, but let's go over the symptoms. The symptoms are very important. Please remember them because they will come in a clinical scenario and you will have to, explain them. Sorry, not explain them, but you will have to know what they're talking about, okay? So, if there is an upper motor neuron lesion, that means that there is no inhibitory reflex on the lower motor neurons. It means that the lower motor neurons will start sending signals and they will contract the muscles constantly, right? So if there's an upper motor neuron lesion, would you have increased reflexes? Yes, you would. We will talk about that later, okay? Would you have increased tone? Yes, because it's constantly contracting. Would you have Babinski's sign? I'll explain that in a second. Would you have spastic paralysis? Yes. We said that you would have spastic paralysis. You would also have positive Babinski's sign. What is Babinski's sign? It's basically a test where they stroke the sole of the foot. And the normal reaction, this normal test, is supposed to be, the toes are supposed to curl downwards, okay? That is the normal reaction to this test. However, if the curls, I don't know why I keep saying that. If the toes curl upwards, then this would be abnormal. This would indicate that there is an upper motor neuron lesion, okay? This is normal in children. However, in adults, this is the normal reaction. You're not supposed to see this, okay? Fine. We finished this part. What about the lower motor neuron lesion? This means that there's no innervation to the muscle at all. So would you have atrophy? Yes, you would have atrophy because it's not contracting. So it will start to atrophy. The muscles will start to atrophy. Would you have fasciculations? Fasciculations are basically like spontaneous involuntary muscle contractions. and relaxation. So this usually involves the fine muscle fibers. So you know when your eyes like sometimes start twitching out of nowhere? This is an example of it, but it applies to the rest of the body, not your eyes. Okay? طيب. So you would have positive fasciculations. This is a sign of lower motor neurons. Please remember these. Would you have increased or would you have hypo or hyperreflexia? You would have hyporeflexia. I'll explain that in the next slide. And you would have decreased tone and flaccid paralysis. Okay? طيب. Now, we said that we would have hyperreflexia, right? When there's an upper motor neuron lesion. Why does this happen? This happens because let's talk about the reflex arc components first. We have the receptor, we have the afferent neuron or the upper motor neuron, and we have the lower motor neuron. The reflex arc, as we mentioned, is formed by the lower motor neuron. So it is going to work even if there is no signal coming from the upper motor neuron. But the upper motor neuron is important because it will be the one that will have an inhibitory influence on the lower motor neuron. So if there's no inhibitory influence on the lower motor neuron from the upper motor neuron, then the reflex arc will just start, working on its own. It's automatic. And so the muscle will be in a constant contracted state. That's why you would have hyperreflexia and upper motor neuron damage. Okay? Right. Now, these are the reflexes and which cord segments they correspond to. This is very, very important. Please memorize it. Why is it important? I will tell you why. Let's say that a patient undergoes reflex testing, okay? So when they did the knee-jerk reflex, they found that it was absent. And when they did the ankle jerk reflex, they found that it was exaggerated. So there was hyperreflexia of the ankle jerk reflex, okay? Sorry. What is the knee-jerk test? Test? It tests the L3 to L4 segment. Since the knee-jerk is absent in this level, this means that the reflex arc at level L3 to L4 is broken, right? So the most likely reason for this is that there is damage to the lower motor neuron. There's no innervation, and so there's no reflex that is happening, and that is why you have hyporeflexia, right? طيب. So now we already suspect a lesion that is at the level of L3, L4. Let's look at the ankle jerk reflex. The ankle jerk reflex, we said that it tests S1 to S2, which is below the level of the suspected lesion. The ankle jerk reflex, we said that it was exaggerated, meaning that there is hyperreflexia. This tells us that the upper motor neuron is lost below the lesion. So this confirms that the level of the lesion is actually L3, L4. That is why it's important to know this. This was an example. So please memorize these. Okay. So this is the case that I told you guys about. So at the level of L3, L4, which is the knee-jerk reflex, it was absent, meaning that the lower motor neurons in the anterior gray horn were not functional, or there was a lesion there, okay? So that is why you had hyperreflexia here. However, in the lower part of the spinal cord, at the level of S1, S2, which is tested by the ankle jerk reflex, we found that there was hyperreflexia. Why is that? Because the upper motor neurons that are descending from upwards from over here, they were cut off at this level. So this segment never got any signal from the upper motor neuron. So that is why you had hyperreflexia of the ankle jerk reflex. Okay, these are the extrapyramidal tracts. I personally memorized this because they were in Dr. Najib's lecture, so it was easy for me to memorize it, but they're really not that important. I don't think you need it, but if you want to do that, go ahead. I really don't think you should know it. طيب, questions? Please pause when you want to. Okay, so why is the answer this one? It is because he had flaccid paralysis over here with visible fasciculations. What does this tell you? This is a lower motor neuron lesion, okay? So where are the lower motor neurons located? In the anterior horn cells, okay? Okay. Why is this the left primary motor cortex? Because there was weakness in the right arm. There was increased muscle tone, hyperreflexia, and increased plantar response. This tells you that this is an upper motor neuron lesion, but the difference here is that all of his lower limbs and his right upper limbs were affected, meaning that this happened on a way, way higher level. Like the upper motor neuron lesion is on a very, very high level because the entire body was affected. So where does that start? The primary motor cortex. Okay, next we have the spinal cord lead. Okay, so everything in this lecture is super high yield. Please know everything on here very, very, very well. So we will start with a review. We have the dorsal column. It was made of the fasciculus gracilis, which is over here, and the fasciculus cuneatus. The fasciculus gracilis supplied the lower body, whereas the fasciculus cuneatus supplied the upper body. The dorsal column was also responsible for two-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception. This is kind of it for this part. And we also mentioned that the fasciculus gracilis that supplies the lower body is more medial, whereas the upper body supply is more lateral. Okay. Now, for the descending tracts, we have the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tracts. One thing that I did not mention earlier to you guys is that the tracts that supply the sacral parts or the lower parts of the body are more lateral, whereas the parts that supply the upper part of the body are located more medial. This is the case for the lateral corticospinal tract and for the corticospinal tracts and the spinothalamic tracts. So same thing goes over here, whereas in the dorsal column, it is the opposite. So medially, you have the supply to the lower limbs first, and then on the lateral side, you have the supply to the upper body, okay? All right, this will be important for the legions. Oh, I forgot to mention the lateral spinothalamic tract was responsible for pain and temperature, whereas the anterior spinothalamic tract was responsible for crude touch and pressure. Okay, so depending on the location and the extent of the injury, there can be different forms of paralysis that can occur. Monoplegia is basically paralysis of one limb. Diplegia is when there's paralysis of both upper limbs or both lower limbs. Paraplegia is when there's paralysis of both lower limbs. Hemiplegia is when there is paralysis in half of the body, not including the head. Specifically, we're talking about the torso, the upper limb, and the lower limb. Quadriplegia is basically just paralysis of all four limbs. We have two different types of spinal cord syndromes. They can either be complete or incomplete. Complete is characterized by complete, from the name, complete loss of motor and sensory function below the level of the lesion, whereas incomplete is characterized by partial loss of sensory or motor functions below the lesion. The first thing that we're going to start with is complete transaction. This is pretty easy. You would have loss of all sensation, all of it, because all of the tracts are affected, all of the sensory tracts are affected, and you would also lose motor control because the descending tracts are affected. All right. You would also have flaccid paralysis at the level of the lesion or the damage, and below that you would have spastic paralysis. So lower motor neuron, upper motor neuron. Next, we are going to be talking about spinal shock. So spinal shock is what happens when someone gets injured. There's complete shock to the spinal cord. So it's an immediate loss of the reflex function. It's called areflexia below the level of the injury. So this can happen a little bit after an injury, and it will last a few months, from a few minutes to several months, after which the activity or the reflex activity would start to return. Now, we will start with the spinal muscular atrophy. Spinal muscular atrophy, please also memorize the other name because they really like to use the alternative names to test you guys. So please memorize these as well. For spinal muscular atrophy, you would have a loss of the anterior horn cells, okay? And what was located in the anterior horn cells? There was the lower motor neurons, the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons. How does this happen? It happens due to a mutation in the SM1 gene. This SM1 gene codes for small ribosomal proteins, and if there was a mutation in this gene, the result would be the degeneration of the anterior horn that we talked about, where the lower motor neurons are located. This would result in these symptoms. So the lower motor neuron symptoms, you would have floppy, they call, it's classic, it's called floppy baby, which is basically flaccid paralysis in babies because this happens normally in babies. There would be tongue fasciculations, you would have hypotonia and hyporeflexia. What else do we want to mention for this part? Yes, this is always, always, always symmetric. This is important for a later syndrome that we will talk about in the next slide, inshallah. I will come back to this. Now, we have ALS. In ALS, basically, there's degeneration of the lower motor neuron, which is in the anterior gray horn cells, and the upper motor neuron, which is the corticospinal tract. This would result in combined upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron signs or lesion signs. However, there would be no sensory problems because the dorsal tracts and the sensory tracts are not affected at all. Okay, please do memorize the other name, the alternative names for everything. They really like to use them. So let's go over the symptoms. First off, why does ALS happen? It happens because there is a major enzyme defect in SOD1 or superoxide dismutase 1. When this mutation happens, there would be aggregation of proteins inside of the mitochondria. That's why you would have free radical injury resulting in degeneration of the neurons. Now, for the symptoms, we have the upper motor neuron symptoms because the corticospinal tract would be affected, as we mentioned before. You would have the ones that we know, the only one that we know is spastic paralysis. I also want you to know dysphagia. This is important because it is very fatal. ALS is very fatal. The cause of death is usually aspiration pneumonia, and it is due to this dysphagia. Okay. In terms of the lower motor neuron symptoms, we know all of these: the limb weakness, fasciculations, atrophy, and flaccid paralysis. Yeah, it is important to note that there are no sensory problems. That is kind of it for this slide. Next, we have poliomyelitis. Now, poliomyelitis is basically the same. It's very, very, very similar as SMA, except that in poliomyelitis, it is asymmetric, whereas in SMN, it is always, always, always symmetric. So you would have lower motor neuron lesion symptoms because the anterior gray horns would be affected. And so the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons would be affected. So you would have flaccid paralysis, you would have hyperreflexia, fasciculations, and the atrophy of the muscles. What else? Yeah, it is caused by polio, and the transmission is fecal-oral. It likes to target the lower limbs more than the upper limbs. But the main thing that I want you to remember is lower motor neuron lesion symptoms and asymmetric weakness, because this will help you differentiate between poliomyelitis and SML. Okay. Next, we will be talking about anterior cord syndrome. Remember when I told you guys about the T8 intersegmental artery, or the artery of Adam Quetz or whatever? This artery, when it is occluded or when it's affected or damaged, there would be complete loss, or there would be ischemia of the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord because the T8 intersegmental artery contributes to the spinal artery. And if you guys remember, the spinal artery would supply the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord. So all the tracts in the anterior column and the lateral column are affected in this case. So everything, basically all the tracts except for the medial lemniscal tracts are affected. Yeah, the dorsal columns are not affected. All the other tracts other than the medial lemniscal tracts, all of them are affected. طيب, now, in terms of the symptoms, let's go over them one by one. So, let's start with the spinothalamic tract. You would have bilateral loss of pain and temperature below the lesion, right? That is due to the damage to the spinothalamic tract. Now, in terms of the corticospinal tract, at the level of the lesion, you would have bilateral flaccid paralysis, whereas below, you would have spastic paralysis. So this is characteristic of an upper motor neuron lesion, and this is a lower motor neuron lesion. What else do we want to discuss here? Yes. Okay, so the classic presentation for anterior cord syndrome is that the patient would undergo an aortic aneurysm repair. And because you have to ligate the aorta, sometimes this can affect the intersegmental artery and occlude it, or for whatever reason, if there's damage to the intersegmental artery during an aortic aneurysm repair, this would result in anterior cord syndrome. This can also happen due to disc prolapse that damages the spinal cord anteriorly. We discussed everything else. Okay. Next, we will be talking about the central cord syndrome. Now, from the name, this affects the center of the spinal cord. The syndrome affects the center of the spinal cord. Remember how we said that the cervical and the upper limb tracts were located more medially, whereas the lower limb and the sacral tracts were located more laterally? The ones that are located more medially would be affected. So the cervical tracts and the upper limb tracts would be affected in this case, whereas the tracts that are located most laterally, like the sacral tract, would be spared. So there's sacral sparing in this case, and the dorsal column would usually be unaffected. So there would be no loss of two-touch discrimination, vibration, or conscious proprioception. Now, the classic presentation of the syndrome is an older patient who has a vehicle injury. So the patient would be an old patient. They would come to your clinic after they had a car crash, and they would be showing these symptoms that I will be talking about in a second. What happens here is that bilaterally, the medial part of the lateral white column is affected, meaning that the medial portions of the corticospinal and the spinothalamic tracts would be affected, specifically the ones that supply the upper limb. So for the spinothalamic tract, you would have a bilateral loss of pain and temperature in the upper limbs, and you would have for the corticospinal tracts, you would have spastic paralysis in the upper limbs, and you would have hyperreflexia, which are upper motor neuron lesion signs. The patient would also have burning feeling in the upper limbs. Okay, I think we have covered everything in the slide. Now, we are going to be talking about syringomyelia. Now, syringomyelia, from the name, syrinx is a fluid-filled cavity in the central canal. And in the specific syndrome, there is a dilation of the central canal that happens with Arnold Chiari, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, Arnold Chiari malformation. And this dilation would affect the lateral spinothalamic pathways that are in the cervical regions of the spinal cord. So, do you guys remember when we talked about the anterior white commissural fibers? So remember how the spinothalamic tract would pass by and then it would cross the midline. That part, the fibers that cross the midline, we call them the anterior white commissural fibers. These fibers will be the ones that are damaged or affected in this specific case. Now, because it is more central, you would have the cervical region and the upper limb region, the cervical region and the upper limb region would be affected because their fibers are more medial. And this would present, like the patient would present with a cape-like loss of pain and temperature with sacral sparing. Again, sacral sparing for the same reason, because lower limb tracts are located, or lower limb fibers are located more laterally. What else? You would have flaccid paralysis. The lesion, if it extends all the way to the anterior horn over here, then you would have lower motor neuron symptoms, and that would include flaccid paralysis. Okay, next we are going to be talking about tapes, dorsalis, or tabes dorsalis. Now, in tabes dorsalis, there would be dorsal column and dorsal root damage. So the dorsal columns and the dorsal roots would be demyelinated, and this is caused by tertiary syphilis, caused by Treponema pallidum. Okay, so let's go through the symptoms of each part. The dorsal columns would be affected, meaning that the patient would have progressive sensory ataxia due to the loss of the conscious proprioception. And because of the demyelination or the damage to the dorsal root, the patient would have a compromised reflex arc. So they would have an absent deep tendon reflex, and this deep tendon reflex is very important. The dorsal root is very important for the execution of the deep tendon reflex, and that is why this reflex would be absent in this case. You would also have positive Romberg sign and a white-based gait. What is the Romberg sign? It's basically when a patient would be able, a positive Romberg sign means that a patient would be completely fine, and they can stand completely fine with their eyes open. However, when you ask them to close their eyes, they would start to lose their balance. These patients would also have sensory ataxia. They would also have sensory ataxia, and that is because they can't consciously perceive the parts of their feet that are touching the ground. Now, this tapes dorsalis is also associated with Charcot joints and Argyll-Robertson pupils. Charcot joints happen because there are no proprioceptive impulses from the feet. So these patients would keep on injuring their feet because they can't feel them. And so they would have a deformity of their joints and their bones. That is what we call Charcot joints. Now, in Argyll-Robertson pupils, it's basically when you shine a light into their eyes, their pupils would not constrict. However, when you get an item or anything and you start getting it close to their eyes, their pupils would accommodate to this object. Okay. Next, we have subacute combined degeneration. This one is very simple because from the abbreviation it has SCD, subacute combined degeneration. You can know which tracts are affected. So the spinocerebellar tract, corticospinal, and the dorsal columns. So let's go through each one one by one. So starting with the spinocerebellar pathway, you would have ataxic gait because the spinocerebellar pathway is affected. Now, for the corticospinal tract, you would have spastic paralysis of the legs, and you would have hyperreflexia because it is an upper motor neuron lesion. And for the dorsal columns, you would have impaired position and vibration sense, so loss of proprioception or conscious proprioception and vibration. This usually happens due to a deficiency in vitamin B12. Specifically, an example would be after a gastrectomy or ileal resection. Doing this would result in pernicious anemia, which would cause vitamin B12 deficiency. You would also see a positive Romberg sign because of the spinocerebellar pathway, and you would have a positive Babinski sign because of the corticospinal pathway that is affected over here. Okay, next we have Friedreich ataxia. Now, Friedreich ataxia is an autosomal recessive trinucleotide repeat disorder. Specifically, we're talking about GAA over here. On chromosome 9, that would encode frataxin. Frataxin is an iron-binding protein, and it leads to the impairment in mitochondrial functioning when it doesn't work properly. So just like SCD over here, you would have the same symptoms. Everything is the same. All the tracts that are affected are the same, except that the dorsal root ganglion is also affected over here. And the patient would have diabetes mellitus and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Okay, now this is probably the most high yield, most important slide in this entire PAL. It is so important. You will get so many questions on it. So please try to be very comfortable with this so that you can get all the questions right, inshallah. It's very simple once you get used to it. I could sit out here and I could spend 10 to 15 minutes explaining to you why there's ipsilateral and contralateral, lots of specific sensations on each part of the spinal cord, so that you can understand why these symptoms happen. on these specific sides, but I generally think that it will confuse you more than it will help you. Knowing these symptoms is more than enough. It will literally, it's all you need. And if you are interested in knowing why they happen, and you have a little bit of extra time on your hands, I would really recommend watching Dr. Al-Fawais, the pal that he made. I think it was around 2 to 3 years ago. I watched it when I was a second year, and it was super, super, super helpful. I really recommend it because it covers both spinal cord lesions and brainstem lesions, and it helps you differentiate between how these two look like clinically. Because I kind of struggled with that a little bit. So I would really recommend watching it. If you want to know why all of these happen, I'm just going to give you the symptoms because I really think that this will help you the most, inshallah. And I don't want to waste too much time on this when it's not needed. Um, Another thing that I just realized that I never mentioned in the beginning of the section is that I've been using Dr. Mariam Al-Tayyib's notes. I will try to link them at the end of the slides once this lecture is uploaded, inshallah. But they are so, so, so helpful. I really recommend that you use them. I use them for my reviews because it put all of the spinal cord lesions in one place. And it was very convenient for me to go back to it whenever I couldn't remember a specific part. And I would really recommend using them. I use them because I didn't want you guys to have like a bunch of different resources. So the PAL has a different order, the notes have a different order. So this will be convenient for you, inshallah. Now, back to the actual content of the PAL. So here we have Brown-Séquard syndrome. And Brown-Séquard syndrome is basically the hemisection of the spinal cord. Why does this happen? It happens due to a stab or a gunshot wound that would result in this syndrome. Now, right after the injury, so right after the stab or the gunshot wound injury, you would have spinal shock. And remember how we said that spinal shock, in spinal shock, you would see flaccid paralysis from a few minutes or a few hours up until a few months. But it is important to note, because they like to trick you with this, is that right after the spinal cord injury, you would have spinal shock. Okay, so you would have flaccid paralysis right after. However, after this spinal shock kind of resolves and settles down, then you would start seeing these symptoms. But these symptoms don't exist right after the injury. The spinal shock has to resolve first for these to show. Okay? Like, now, honestly, the best way that I could like help you with this is that I want you to remember that everything is on the ipsilateral side except for pain and temperature. Okay? Let's start with that. So, at the level of the lesion, you would have flaccid paralysis, and you would have band anesthesia on the ipsilateral side. So flaccid paralysis, because it is an upper motor neuron lesion, at the level of the lesion or at the level of the damage, which makes complete sense. You would have flaccid paralysis at the same level, and you would have band anesthesia on the ipsilateral side. Okay, so everything ipsilateral. Now, moving to the part that is below the level of the lesion, you would have ipsilateral loss of two-touch discrimination, or actually, let me say this in a better way. Ipsilateral spastic paralysis, so we're talking about the upper motor neuron symptoms. You would have ipsilateral spastic paralysis, hyperreflexia, and positive Babinski sign. And you would also have loss of the medial lemniscal or the dorsal tract sensations. So you would have loss of two-touch discrimination, vibration, and conscious proprioception. So what about contralaterally, right? Contralaterally, you would have loss of pain and temperature. That is the only thing that would be on the contralateral side below the level of the lesion. So to review, at the level of the lesion, you would have flaccid paralysis and you would have ipsilateral band anesthesia. Below the level of the lesion, you would have ipsilateral spastic paralysis, hyperreflexia, positive Babinski sign, and you would have ipsilateral loss of dorsal column sensations. The only thing that is contralateral is loss of pain and temperature. Okay, that is everything that you need to know for this part. Another thing that is very important to note before we move on is that if the T1 level and above, if these levels are involved, you would have ipsilateral Horner's syndrome. Again, ipsilateral. So everything is ipsilateral except for the loss of pain and temperature that is contralateral. What is Horner syndrome? Horner syndrome is anhidrosis, ptosis, and meiosis. Anhidrosis, loss of sweating. Ptosis is drooping of the eyelids, and meiosis, constriction of the pupils. So this is everything that you need to know. And the reason that, what's it called? The involvement of this level and above would cause ipsilateral Horner syndrome is because of the involvement of the sympathetic nervous system. Next, we have the cauda equina syndrome. We kind of already went over this, but you would have saddle anesthesia and you would have incontinence, specifically fecal and urinary incontinence, and this happens because of the loss of the bladder and anal sphincters, and that is why you would have these symptoms. So cauda equina happens when there's compression of the spinal roots below the level at the level of L2 and below. This could happen due to a tumor or due to IV disc herniation. There would be a loss of anal wink reflex. Memorize it because they like to ask it in question, or they like to mention it in questions. If you hear loss of anal wink reflex, you want to instantly think cauda equina syndrome. Saddle anesthesia, so you would have anesthesia in the lumbar and the sacral regions. What else do you want to mention here? I think that's about it. Okay, lastly, we have Guillain-Barré syndrome. And Guillain-Barré syndrome, the main presentation that you need to know about it is that it has or presents with ascending, bilateral, symmetric flaccid paralysis. So you have the lower motor signs, you have flaccid paralysis. Okay, so basically, the presentation would show you that the lower limbs were paralyzed first, and then this paralysis would ascend and it would start getting to the upper limbs. And this is how you would know that this is the syndrome they're talking about. Eventually, the respiratory muscles, the paralysis would reach the respiratory muscles, causing death due to respiratory failure. Now, for the final questions. Okay. So this shows a hemisection of the spinal cord. So we said that there would be ipsilateral. Okay, so first thing, let's look at the contralateral loss of pain and temperature, right? Because we know that that is the very distinguishing feature. So let's look for that in the options. Is it there? No, you only have contralateral loss of crude touch. Let's remove that option. Ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature. No, we know it's contralateral, so we want to remove these as well. So we're going to remove all of these options. The answer is ipsilateral loss of vibration, not pressure, because that is the dorsal column. Next, the answer to this is E. Why is the answer E? Because over here, you will see that the patient had right-sided hemiplegia. We know that this is Brown-Séquard syndrome, or we are suspecting that this is Brown-Séquard syndrome. How do we confirm this? What was the distinguishing symptom that we knew? Contralateral loss of pain and temperature. So let's look for that. We want to look for left-sided loss of pain and temperature. Here, on the left side, you have loss of pain and temperature sensations. So this confirms to you that this is Brown-Séquard syndrome. So you would have right-sided hemisection of the spinal cord. Okay. You guys already know this. There we go. That is it. For the PAL, thank you so much for watching this. I really, really, really do hope that this is helpful for you guys. Please do scan the QR code to give me my feedback. I really want to hear what you guys think. If you see me around university and you have opinions about the PAL, especially if they're bad, please do come up to me and tell them to me. I really do want to improve, and I would really, really appreciate your feedback. I put a lot of effort into this, and I really hope that you guys benefit from this. Have a great rest of your day. Good luck on your TBLs, midterm, or final. Bye-bye.